All right, we are live.
We are live.
At least that's what it's telling us,
Yeah.
whatever that's
I
worth.
guess we should officially start the podcast recording.
All
Uh,
right, yeah.
Go from there.
Do you
So
want me to start, or you want to start?
I'll start.
Good.
Greetings, Doug. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you, John?
I'm okay. You can tell that our place is coming along. We actually have a shrine set up behind me, and
Yeah, for
uh,
those of us who are watching, you will see it. Otherwise, you will simply hear
um,
about it.
and the room is so bright that we have to put the blinds down. Otherwise, I would be completely backlit. Although it's cloudy today, or at least this morning, so would have been fine. But anyway, so yeah, it's comfortable. It's our place is coming along.
You're getting set up. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
great.
yeah, yeah. So, and you?
Doing all right. Yeah, I'm back. Recovered for sure after I had COVID a couple weeks ago, and we talked about that a little bit. But
Your
I'm
taste has
fine.
come back.
Smell, well, yeah, smell. It's
Yeah,
the taste was always there. It's the smell that is coming back. It's one of these things where I'm sure that I'm not smelling everything I used to smell, but it's getting better. So
right.
little by little. It's kind of an interesting Buddhist
Indeed.
experience, of losing sense contact. But it's not something you're aware of all the time. It's like if you become blind, of course you'd be aware of that immediately, or deaf, but losing smell, I mean, so most of your day you're not really smelling a whole lot. So it's only when you're sort of face to face with something like
Yeah, yeah, it's
coffee
true.
coffee or something that you realize I didn't
Yeah, and of course, when
smell
you
it.
lose your smell, you do lose some of your taste. So it's like, how much is related, and it's an interesting
Yeah.
way of. It's a whole other discussion.
Yep. Yeah. Well, it's related.
Yeah. Yeah. So, what are we talking about today?
Nibbidā is the Pali term, and it has various translations. And this is part of the issue, frankly. Some people translate it more as sort of disenchantment,
Hmm.
uh, but others translate it as more disgust. And there's, if you read a number of papers or sort of, essays or discussions, talks, Dharma talks about this, you'll have different teachers emphasizing one or another of these interpretations and saying this is the right one. Because on the one hand, you'll have people saying, "Look, disenchantment is it's our it's something that's in one paper I was reading, which is very interesting. Pia Tan, who does a lot of sort of
Yeah.
Dharma, he talks about how it's sort of like the key to kind of a spiritual approach to life is this kind of disenchantment, we might say, um, which comes about as we're sort of we begin by being enchanted by sense experience and getting involved in beautiful things and so on, but eventually there's this disenchantment that takes over. um on the other hand, you have people who say, disenchantment isn't strong enough. It's a kind of a disgust with that kind of life. um and I imagine that difference of translation sort of depends upon whether you're sort of more of a layperson or more of a sort
Mhm.
of a monastic in orientation.
And
I think
the other translation is dispassion.
um
Uh,
I think well, yeah, it could be. I mean, I think dispassion sort of originates from this kind of. I mean, I think of it as
is there
dispassion
another
comes.
Pali word for
I think
dispassion?
so. Yeah. I don't have it in front of me
Ah,
right
okay.
now. Yeah,
Uh,
but dispassion is what comes after. So you lose the passion because of this disenchantment or this disgust.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
it's it's an aspect of practice which I think is sometimes not emphasized very much in the contemporary way of looking at practice, because we tend to think of practice as very, how do I want to put it? The practice goes along with a sort of an experience of life, where we integrate our practice with those beautiful experiences we have of the sunset and so on. And that's one way to understand practice, but another way again is this kind of, I think a little bit more austere, where we
Well, or one is further down the path to some degree. I mean, I think that it can be. I mean, there are of course elements in the in the 32 parts of the body practice, which is part of the first teaching in the Satipatthana, that talks about this part of the body is ugly, and every
right.
part of the body, if you see it independently of itself, independently of the whole body, is in a way ugly or disgusting or whatever.
Right.
So we let go of the attachment to the body in that way of practicing. If we saw this body as nothing but a series of parts, how would we feel about the body? So
Right.
yeah, interesting. And then how do we deal with it? I mean, how do we hold it, and how do we practice with it? And I suppose one way, I know that it's like, for instance, in the context of the hindrances, when we talk about the hindrance of sense desire,
Exactly.
we see a beautiful piece of fruit, and we really want that fruit, and but if then we think about what that fruit looks like after it's passed through our digestive system, would we feel the same way? And so it's a way of kind of alleviating that. It's a way of counteracting that hindrance. It's an antidote to that hindrance, even more so if we're on retreat and just incredibly attracted to somebody on the retreat. How does that person, how would we feel about seeing the corpse of that person? I mean, these are the extreme ways of practicing, and it's
Right.
I can imagine that for some people it's actually quite effective if you really have a challenge with sense desire. And I know for me it would be, sense desire is more than like is my go-to hindrance. Sort of a default hindrance would be sense desire. And if I considered disenchantment and reflected on it more directly in those cases, I would get past it more quickly. But I kind of enjoy it while it's there. It's like,
Well, it is enjoying that's part of the issue. I mean, there's a very a famous sort of 3-part series in a lot of Buddhist early Buddhist suttas, which is this trio of gratification, danger, and escape. So there's the gratification that comes with not only sense desire, but when sense desire is realized, when you have a desire for something beautiful, and I mean, I always think of sort of like taking a vacation down to the beach somewhere, I mean, that's kind of like, my go-to for like sense desire. It's like, oh, sitting out on the beach and, under the sun with the palm trees, right? And when you're there, I mean, there's this gratification. There's
until you get
this
sunburn.
well, until you get, well, yeah, that's believe me, talk to me about that. But then there's the danger, which is that these things, as we all know, are temporary, and eventually you're going to be, you've got a 3-day vacation or 4-day vacation down on the beach, and on that 4th day, you're sitting there getting packed up and thinking, God, I've got to go back, and and I've got to get back on the airplane and go through those lines again, and I've got to go back to that same, that's the danger. And so if you've been through that process a number of times of the gratification and the danger, there is a potential for escape through this kind of nibbidā, of disenchantment, of realizing, I've been through that process before, any number of times, and it didn't change my life. I mean, I'm no happier now, and any happiness that I gain out of that is going to be temporary, and then it's going to be, back to the same grind again. So, I mean, I think that's the sort of process where we get disenchanted, and while we may, still, I mean, it's not to say that we dislike being on the beach under the palm trees,
Right.
but it's just to say that we see through that, you know.
Yeah, and on the flip side, of course, that's the way you just described that particular one, where you have to get back and then get back to your job and your whatever, you know. We can also see through the disenchantment in that,
Sure.
and not let it bring us down if it does. I mean, obviously that's not the case for everybody, you know. I mean, but you know, most people when they come off vacation are not necessarily looking forward to getting back to their day-to-day routines, you know. But one can become not one can learn to accept those day-to-day routines as uh, as beautiful as the vacation you were on. So you sort of have equanimity, you know. In a way, disenchantment can lead to equanimity, I suppose, and that's actually the dispassion would definitely lead to equanimity. And so, you know, can we hold things in an equanimous way?
Yeah.
So that which we're enamored of is really ends up being no different than that which we are not enamored of, in a sense.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's freedom, because we're not bouncing back and forth between it all. So it leads to the, you know, worldly winds and all of that, you know. And then of course we can see the suffering that arises from enchantment or from passion, right? Just in the sense that we cling to it. And I think one of the more direct ways, I'm just thinking of this program that Judson Brewer developed. I think I may have talked about this before, but Judson Brewer, who's a practitioner and also a serious researcher at the Center for Brown Mindfulness Center, and he's written a number of books. But I think the first, he also developed an app called Craving to Quit, which is for those who want to quit smoking. And as I recall, the first thing he instructs people to do is to smoke and actually really pay attention to the experience of the actual experience of the smoke entering the body and the taste of the smoke and all of that. Because of course the addiction has very little to do with that. I mean, there's the nicotine addiction, you know, which is separate from the flavor and the experience. And it's like, when you really pay attention to it, is it pleasant, right? And suddenly people realize actually it's kind of disgusting.
Yeah.
Or of course, if you think about, you know, when it's going into the lungs, how is it? Oh, yeah. So it's a way of breaking, you know, a cycle of clinging and addiction, and even addiction. If you really look, you know, and, you know, in a way, it's also the basis for any 12-step program.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you see the problem, you actually explore the situation, the problem, and say, you know, is this really helping me? Is it something that I should, you know? And so it's this, yeah, it can actually be quite deep.
Yeah.
And so what you're suggesting is that, and I couldn't find the word, the Pali word for dispassion, but it is separate. I mean, in looking at the definitions of nibbidā, it's, you know, that doesn't bring up dispassion. But you're suggesting that dispassion comes from nibbidā.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the sutta in front of me right now, but yes, I believe that there is a sutta that has a sort of I think it's a form of dependent origination. I think it's the one that Bhikkhu Bodhi calls, like you know, transcendent dependent origination. I think is what he calls it.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
and yeah, I mean, in that one, I believe its dispassion arises from the disenchantment that we have. So, you know, we normally have this kind of enchantment with daily life, and I mean, of aspects of daily life anyhow, whether that, in a certain sense, we can understand it um, as a kind of addiction, obviously not as strong as nicotine addiction, but a kind of
Well,
addiction that we
sure.
have
Some
to,
people it is as strong. I mean, in many ways.
yeah, yeah, it can be, but but some kind of an addiction to sense experience, pleasant sense experience.
Yeah.
And when we when we get to that stage, or at least we can get glimpses of that during our lives, of this kind of disenchantment with that addiction, this realization that, yeah, going and whatever, listening to some beautiful concert is nice, but it's not going to change my life in a way that, when I was younger, I would have thought, there would have been a way that my mind would have gone to think,
Oh,
this is
for
going to
sure.
be life changing. And then when you've been through it a number of times, there is this, I think disenchantment is a great word, disenchantment with the whole process. Which isn't to say you hate it. It's just to say, okay, I see what it is. I see it for what it is. Now, there's this whole thing with the disgust, which I think is really easy. I should say interesting to think about, because as I say, some people think disgust is the right word here. But others, and myself will be included in that, sort of think that disgust sounds a little bit too like there's a rejection involved, like you're pushing back on it, and that it sounds like ill will, and that doesn't sound to me like it's an appropriate way of approaching this problem. It doesn't help you to be having ill will at this stuff. It's
Right.
just not enchanting us. It's just not. It's
So that's, I think that's, so a suba, I think, is maybe
mm,
loathsome, that's
yeah,
kind
exactly.
of, and sometimes, it's, I guess it depends on in a way, it depends on the whole, one has to become aware of the hold of a pleasant Vedana on each, everybody's response to pleasant Vedana, the pleasant feeling tone, is different. Some of us, it's like, oh, we can't, if something is unpleasant, we don't want it, and if something pleasant, we have to keep it and have it, and if the hold is that strong, and when it comes to sense desire, it can certainly be that way, and then like, oh well, but yeah, if you think of the corpse instead of the person, that may be really helpful. So it's, in a way, it's a tool of investigation. I suppose one could look at it that way. And as you say, it's really, it's coming in, it's bringing that mindfulness of Vedana, mindfulness of feeling tone, really into puts that in the context of how we actually experience life. And it's when I teach Vedana, generally I say, it's exhausting, right? Because we're constantly, we're always kind of going back and forth between these things.
Mm-hmm.
And if we just see the impermanent nature of it all, then, and this is where it comes to the last tetrad of the Anapanasati Sutta, where the first contemplation is contemplating impermanence. The next contemplation is contemplating dispassion.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you recognize the impermanent nature of these pleasant feelings or the unpleasant feelings, then dispassion can be passion, or passion can be ease, which would be dispassion,
Mm-hmm.
I guess. So, and if you need to see it in a loathsome way to help that along, if it's that, okay, so it's a tool, in a sense, which I could see being useful. It certainly wouldn't
Yeah.
I don't think it finds its way into some of the later teachings in that direct way.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, it's pretty direct. It's pretty hardcore if you think about it.
Yeah. No, it is. It is. And that's why I say, I think to me, a lot of those kinds of instructions, I mean, they strike me as instructions more for monastics than for lay people.
Mhm.
Just because of their, I don't want to, I'm not sure exactly how to describe it, but their sort of harshness.
Yeah.
They strike me as the kind of the kind of instructions you would give to somebody who, was going to be, celibate and, very, very austere in their life choice.
Yeah.
And you would think that somebody who had chosen that kind of life probably would have done so because of strong negative emotions towards some of these dangers. That they were very aware of the dangers. There's this trio of gratification, danger, and escape.
Mhm.
And I mean, at least to me, it seems that one of the distinctions between the sort of lay life and the monastic life is that the layperson is less caught up in the dangers here. I mean, they're more on the gratification side. I mean, they see that. I mean, if they're practicing, if they're aware, if they're wisely aware of this, then of course they are aware of dangers. But they're okay with the gratifications, to an extent because they're still lay people. Whereas it seems to me, I mean, maybe we should get some monastics on here, but that the monastic
We will
is
do that.
yeah,
Yes.
no, absolutely. But,
Yeah.
is somebody who says, these dangers are so great. I'm so aware of them. They're so in front of me.
Yeah.
That, again, and this is part of that disillusionment, with the world, that leads to the complete renunciation,
Yeah. Yeah. And it'd be interesting to have both a monastic and a former monastic, both of which can be done.
Oh, yeah,
And
sure.
and so because I'm not. I mean, the few former monastics that I know, um, in one case it was they fell in love, two monastics, right, and they decided, okay, that was more important to them, and they felt they could do more for the world by leading the monastic life. So it was I don't know that had to do with passion. It certainly had to do with love. And so, it's like to some degree, it's a fine line. And of course, many monastics, I would imagine, many people who go into the monastic life, celibacy is probably the hardest thing at first. Maybe,
Mhm.
I don't know. It would be an interesting thing to ask, and that practice, that investigation around asubha, around or that if you bring that into the mind, that disgust, or that loathsome nature, how does that change things? And I think actually, I think that's the advantage and the learning with the hindrances, particularly that hindrance of sense desire, is like, well, so any of you who are practicing and sense desire is high on your list of hindrance obstacles, well, what can you learn from that? If it's really challenging and you bring in this picture of whatever it is, in its end state, after you digest it or after you die or whatever it does, how does it look? So,
Or just the end state after you've finished experiencing it, as I say, at the end of the
right,
vacation when,
right,
the vacation's or when you've finished that cookie or that
sure,
box of cookies
right,
and you're sitting there feeling like, oh, what a, your stomach is upset and you're kind of,
right,
ugh, I mean, and if, I mean, that's part of the danger. These are the
yeah,
dangers. And I think that kind of wisdom that comes only through experience, can be useful to us if we
absolutely,
reflect upon it, you
absolutely,
know.
yeah. So it's having the experience and then using that experience to reflect back on when it comes up again,
Yeah.
and saying, maybe I'll act differently.
Yeah, and from a lay perspective, it doesn't mean that we, decide never to have another cookie in our lives, maybe, but we
Or coffee or ice
or
cream or whatever.
coffee
Yes.
or ice cream or take a vacation
Yeah.
down to the beach or whatever it
Yeah.
happens to be,
Yeah. Yeah.
but it's
So,
rather to do it with a wiser mindset and awareness of the dangers so that we can mitigate some of them. I mean, because we can at least those lay people among us will say that there's, look, we can do our best to hold on to some of the gratification while mitigating the worst of the dangers if we have some
yeah.
wisdom.
Yeah. Yeah. So, friends, try it out.
Nibbidā.
Yeah. And of course, we still have this gratification problem
We do with
with
the
coffee.
coffee.
I
Yeah.
mean, and what can I say? We all need one.
Yep.
We are lay. And besides which, I know plenty of monastics who love coffee.
Sure. Yeah.
So,
It wakes you up.
yeah.
It's just
So if you'd like to support the show, you are welcome to go to our website and buy us as much coffee as you'd like.
digging the Dharma.
Yeah. So diginthedharma.com, and we appreciate your support. It helps us cover our costs and keep
Yep.
our coffee flowing.
It
Great.
does.
Yeah.
Keeps us awake.
All right.
Thanks, John. Good
Next
to talk
time, Doug.
with you.
And everyone else, keep digging the Dharma.